Taking notes from Donkey Kong Jr. from Mr. Nintendo himself, the new Donkey Kong Container Security Guard, Silex! I'm sure he'll do a good job. I mean, you can juggle being a bounty hunter, you can juggle going after the Galactic Federation, which, you know, I'm not going to spoil anything. Hoping the best for Silex to see a bit more of the light, but I'm sure he'll do a good job. He will definitely be around. Thank you to Curtis Sohara FMG, aka Cool Dude, aka Curtis McClelland, for sending me that Silex amiibo out of nowhere. And he knows how much I love Prime Hunters. It's definitely advertised in my username since 2006. He was with most of my Metroid Prime 4 playthrough on 100%. In fact, he was the one that kind of nudged the idea of 100%. I didn't really realize the full scope of it at the time, but I was like, oh yeah, I guess I could go for 100% here. I originally was just going for, you know, a regular playthrough, but I'm glad he did. Tremendous game. Even if you've never played Metroid before, please check it out if you have a Switch 1, Switch 2. Definitely a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to the next Metroid game in the series and what impact Prime 4 will have in terms of the things they introduce. I love that it has a lot of elements from Prime Hunters, from specific aim to, you know, the weapon management with your ammo system. Silex is in it. There's critical hits, you know, with headshots and just critical, like, hurt box areas on the enemies. Obviously, the music's really good. You know, just a lot of great stuff on brand with how legendary of a series Metroid is, just in general. And playing Prime 4, I was just in awe all the time because the story of Prime 4, you know, Silex was in the secret ending of Metroid Prime 3. And Richard Verodi, the narrative creator of Silex, with Andrew Jones being his visual designer for him and the other Prime Hunters, Richard Verodi did not know Silex was going to be in the ending of Prime 3, and he loved it. Imagine you create these characters. You're tasked with the near impossible task of creating 6 distinct parallels to Samus, and you hit a grand slam. And then you find out that, you know, some of the, you know, the head honchos at Metroid and Nintendo are interested in, you know, using Silex in the game, and at Retro Studios they put him in, and we see him in Prime 4. We saw him a bit in Federation Force. Really cool. I would love to hear his impressions of Prime 4. But see, that's an interesting thing, is that Silex came from, you know, another, you know, United States development studio for Nintendo. Nintendo often, a lot of its development is in Japan, but Retro Studios, along with, you know, software and design from Nintendo, they both worked on Metroid games. And so Metroid Prime Hunters, you know, I love that Nintendo, they wanted to push the DS, and so they trusted the software and development team to make a Metroid game on the DS. And yeah, Spire came from a lot of these amazing characters, some of most favorite characters ever. And that was Nintendo trusting Competency. You know, these developers never worked on a Metroid game before. And Retro Studios could be said of the same thing for Metroid Prime 1. Nintendo trusted Competency. They took a risk here. I think in the era of the GameCube, Nintendo, they were firing off all cylinders for developers. Not just developers, but developing software. But they were looking at talent. They were understanding that, you know, Microsoft and Sony were fierce competitors, and Sega early on with the Dreamcast. And then Sega quickly helped out Nintendo by putting the Sonic Adventure games there. But still, Nintendo was really looking for talent. And I have noticed that with the game industry now, I think we need to do that again. I think Nintendo and a lot of other companies need to really surge up the drive to talent scouting. You know, I remember being in high school, and, you know, you would go to music events, you'd go to football games, you every now and then they'd talk about a talent scout being there. And at first you're like, whoa, someone is, you know, paid to just go watch sports games and watch, you know, artistic presentations, you know, fine art related things. I was like, that's pretty cool. Oh, that's not just cool, that's a necessity, you know, for looking for highly competent people to potentially put on your team, whether it's business or sports or a band, I think that's huge. And I actually think a lot of the AAA game studios are underestimating that. We're seeing a current issue where, as much as I love Prime 4, Metroid Prime 3 came out in 2007. So it's been over 18 years since that Silex ending. And I don't mind waiting. My username, like I said, is from 2006. We haven't seen Spire in a Metroid game ever since. We've seen him in things like Smash Bros. Brawl. And then, some of the Prime Hunters showed up in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. But in terms of the Prime Hunters returning, we've really just seen Silex. And I won't spoil Prime 4, but I loved how he was presented in there overall. But I don't mind waiting. That's the thing is, I don't think we would have to wait 18 more years for Prime 5. I think we're going to get a Metroid game in a few years. That being said, I think there could be a lot more games for Metroid, F-Zero, Star Fox, Startropics. I've been saying on live streams the past few weeks that Nintendo should be making a sci-fi division. Obviously, Retro Studios has Metroid down pretty well, but, there's been such a high demand for their sci-fi games, and they unfortunately haven't had a lot of games lately. And, Nintendo is doing so financially well, I think they can, I don't even want to call it take a financial risk. I feel like a well-marketed Star Fox, F-Zero, Startropics, Metroid game, I think they would make their money back on average, and probably then some. Metroid Dread sold well, Metroid Prime 4 is looking to sell well. But this all comes down to, again, talent scouting. And Nintendo, obviously, they treat their employees pretty well. But with other game studios, there's been a lot of layoffs the past few years. And it's just this constant push and shove. I couldn't even say push. It's kind of just a shove of, some of the higher ups just keep making more and more money, but they're not wanting to hire more people, or they're not keeping people around for more projects. So there's been a lot of implosions in the game industry. And so a lot of games we're waiting for that we would love take a lot longer to make. Not just from that, but it's also the lack of a hired talent scout can, just it basically, there's a bridge between customers and the creators. And when you don't even have a big of a bridge, or it's not that sturdy, or a bridge isn't really made at all, you're just trying to hear from across the lake, right? The river, from a stream, a river, a giant lake bridge, right? Regardless, if you're having to listen for the echoes across the other side, you might not hear what fans might be wanting. But when you hire a talent scout, it's not just about them listening, it's about them being constructive about what are people consistently wanting, and also what was consistently working and not working. I really think, let's say I worked for Nintendo, let's say I owned Nintendo, and I hired some talent scouts. They're paid salary, and I'd tell them, hey, when you go on YouTube and you type in F-Zero GX Mute City music, what happens when you scroll down? You see comments in most of those, videos about the music. But not just about the music, people are praising what they love about F-Zero GX. They're saying, I would love for another game. I would pay for another game. I think that because the bridge isn't, super sturdy right now, that loss of connection can cheat out a company like Nintendo from, making a lot more games like F-Zero that fans would want. And I know that running a business has a lot of, gears to it. There's also stock investors, but ironically, there was a stock investor for a stock investor in Nintendo that asked about F-Zero. And so, again, Nintendo, I think they treat their employees in some of the best ways possible compared to a lot of the other big companies right now. But no matter the company, we're currently, I think we'll see Half-Life 3 next year. We are waiting for that announcement. And Half-Life 3, Metroid Prime 4, The Elder Scrolls 6, they all have a similar thing where people have been waiting a long time for these sequels. And people were willing to buy these games 10 years ago, and obviously don't rush the games. But I do think there is a current situation at hand for game industries where they have created legacy intellectual properties. Again, Half-Life, Elder Scrolls, Metroid, and beyond. and people want to buy those games. There are so many companies out there that struggle to get people to buy one product, but the fact that you can put Samus on a cover and people will buy it, that's tremendous. That's an amazing spot to be in. And so I think the remedy to this is you need to trust competency, not just with your talent scouts, but I always use the Cadence of Hyrule example. Nintendo did a pretty big thing in the 2010s where they kind of hired an indie dev team to work on a Zelda game. It was a spin-off and it was really cool. And I was like, they should do more of this. In fact, there's this game that I'm backing on Kickstarter called X Zodiac. And it's basically a spiritual sequel to the original Star Fox and Star Fox 2. And it basically is the type of game where if they had the rights to Star Fox, I think they'd use it. That being said, I'm not going to undermine the original things they made here. It seems like it's great. The music sounds good and I look forward to playing it. That being said, I feel like Nintendo should talent scout those people. If your main developers are busy working on the next Super Mario and Legend of Zelda games, hire them to make the next Star Fox game. Trust competency. Have some meetings with them like you're an investor. You invest in the business, you keep in touch, look at their development, but you also trust their competency. I think if we did that, we'd get a lot more of, Star Fox, F-Zero, Metroid. And I always mention Startropics because that was my first video game, but I do love Mike Jones as a character. It got a sequel on the NES, and my parents loved that game. My brother loves that game. It's a cool game. It really is another take on Zelda. It's a very action-oriented dungeon-type adventure game, and I would love to see it in modern day. And so I think I love how patient a lot of fans are for, like I said, Elder Scrolls, Metroid. I'm glad that people are doing that, Half-Life, but yeah, I think there is some type of almost social accountability. You're not obligated to make another Half-Life game. No, I just think that there is a win-win scenario where, if you have excess money, of a lot of extra money you can spend, hire some contractors, get those IPs rolling again. The fans are going to love it. You'll probably make your money back. But again, that the biggest leap is, you jump across that river and say, hey, you want to build a bridge with me? And I want to say, I think one of the biggest leaders in competent, AAA studio understanding, and basically they are the equivalent of having a Golden Gate Bridge right now, is Sega. In the 2010s, Sega started really pushing a down-to-earth model of understanding what the fans are looking for. My favorite example is the game Sonic Unleashed came out in the late 2000s, and half the game is really good. The Werehog stages needed a lot of polish. Maybe if you made it a lot like Devil May Cry, you would have a pretty overall great game. But the general consensus is half the game's good, but the parts where Sonic turns into a werehog, yeah, it needs a lot of work. Well, a lot of fans brought that up, and Sega listened. And they released what is still my favorite Sonic game, which is Sonic Colors, which basically is the daytime stages of Sonic Unleashed, but as new levels with a new plot, new settings. And they kind of, after that, they went into Sonic Generations, and they've done pretty well overall. I know Sonic Forces, obviously could have been a lot better, but I do appreciate that it was still on the right, framework of what was working before, and they tried some other things, and you can tell they got more feedback from it. Sonic Mania was, indie developers being trusted by Sega to work on a big Sonic game, and they succeeded. And I just really appreciate that Sega has been so down to earth in understanding what people really want. And I think that's the last thing, is that it's not just about what fans want, but understanding competency from fans. Because, yeah, there is this thing where, if you play competitive shooter or fighting games, there can be a lot of fans of those games that, they just have knee-jerk anger reactions. In Street Fighter 6, someone could be losing to Ken over and over, and then they go on the Capcom forums, or they go on Capcom's Facebook page and say, nerf Ken, nerf Ken, nerf Ken. If the developers listened to every, customer like that, every player, then we could have crazy balance patches that might not be super healthy for the game if it's out of, the drive of pettiness. So again, I think hiring competent talent scouts, competent social media people that really understand how to dissect, like, oh, this person's giving good constructive feedback. This person is angry because they lost to Ken a few times. That's huge. Because now you can really, kind of sort the eggs in the baskets and then bring to your boss the good eggs. And I think there's just, again, a win-win situation. I think one of the big thresholds with that is the companies are going to they need to be willing to pay these people. Pay the people that listen to the fans. Pay the people that competently can work with your IP and make more games for it. And I think it returns in spades. I love one of my favorite video games. In fact, one of the key components to starting I Love Mondays is Shovel Knight. Because summer 2014, this game comes out that is basically a 4-way combination of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, DuckTales, Super Mario Bros. 3, and all the Mega Man classic games. And what a dream come true. And it's not any of those IPs, so they could, they made their own original IP. And he went on, oh sorry, Silex, he'll be alright, he can heal. I'm sure Shovel Knight will share some HP. They became one of the most successful indie games of all time, that they started making merchandise ASAP. I remember getting the Shovel Knight cookie cutter, like right when the game came out, and it's just, people wanted to wear the shirts, they wanted to have Shovel Knight, on their wardrobes, on their bags, and, buying the music, which by the way, Jake Kaufman still offers the Shovel Knight soundtrack for free, but it's pay what you want. I think someone like him, oh yeah, I'm always going to throw like at least $5 his way when he releases stuff like that. And again, a super competent development team that if Nintendo was like, hey, we're thinking about making a game like Zelda 2 again, I think that's a match made in heaven. So again, get your talent scouts to look for stuff like that and take more risks. Take more risks, but the risks, they're not going to be as devastating when you're doing a bit of research and you're understanding the landscape of how video games are going. I really appreciate that Prime 4 came out. I really appreciate all my friends and family for, they know my username alone and how much I love Metroid, but I appreciate the love that people can share for all these great video games, and I hope that continues to run in the terms of positive momentum for the fans and for developers having fun making these games. I love Mondays.